So we'll transition into our next session. Thank you again very much, Nikki. So great to have you here. But speaking of missions, we're going to talk about future large mission planning, strategic planning right now. Moderating this panel is Mark Clampin. Mark is director of the Astrophysics Division at NASA's Science Mission Directorate. Prior to this role, Mark was director of the Sciences and Exploration Directorate here at Goddard. He also served as the James Webb Space Telescope Observatory project scientist and subsequently director of the Astrophysics Science Division and deputy director of SED. Mark graduated from the University of London with a BS in physics and from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland with a PhD in astronomy. I think, is the panel all set? Yeah, I'll give you a clicker.
Great.
And with that, please welcome Mark.
Okay, well, good morning, everybody. For me, it feels like afternoon. I flew in from Cleveland this morning, and it was already snowing there, so interesting trip. Anyway, Dr. Nikki Fox has already done a great job of introducing the Habitable Worlds Observatory, and the real goal of this panel is to talk about how we're going to do this program and some of the challenges that would face it. So let me start off by just introducing our panel. Next to me, I have Dr. Z.B. Turtle, who is a research scientist at the Applied Physics Lab, and is also, of course, the principal investigator of Dragonfly, and was also a collaborator on the NASA Large Mission Study that we both served on. Then we have Dr. Lee Feinberg, who's the JWST Senior Optical Scientist. Francesco Bordi, who is with the Aerospace Corporation. And finally, Dr. Sarah Lipsey, who is with Ball Aerospace and has just taken up a new position as the Director of New Business. So we have a great panel here. I'm going to start off by just trying to set the stage here very quickly. So let me start by just moving forward here. So as everybody knows, one of the key features of the Astrophysics Decadal Survey is that it names a large flagship. So every 10 years, our national academies conduct the survey, and they make a number of recommendations. But one of them is always to address one of the really big scientific questions. And over the decades, those recommendations have produced the Hubble Space Telescope, the Chandra Space Telescope, Spitzer, and more recently, the James Webb Space Telescope. And unfortunately, I'm not going to show any really neat pictures, but I will say I saw one this morning that will be released in a couple of weeks, so I can't tell you what it is, but it really... I have to keep people guessing, right? But I will say it really speaks to what we're going to talk about today, and it kind of made me sit down and just take a moment because it was such an amazing image. So that will be coming out in a few weeks. But each decade, we get one of these recommendations. The next large flagship is the Programmer Record from the 2010 Decadal Survey, and that's the Roman Space Telescope. And that's very unique because most of these large missions are typically what we call point and shoot, which is a sort of very crude way of saying that they generally don't have large fields of view, and the science is focused on doing long pointed observations. Roman instead is a survey satellite and will survey large portions of the infrared sky to address issues like dark energy, dark matter, and also what the outer parts of solar systems around other stars look like. So Roman is already well underway and making great progress. So what we're going to talk about today is the 2021 Decadal Survey. And the key recommendation from that survey is a near-infrared optical ultraviolet 6-meter telescope. And some of you will know this telescope already as IRUV, and one of the first things I was asked to do by Thomas Zurbuch, and when I was hired 6 months ago, was find a name for it that we could use as a working name. So Habitable Worlds Observatory is the name of this mission until NASA gives it a formal name. And it's going to do two basic things as recommended by the Decadal Survey. One is to survey nearby stars and look for habitable planets, that is, planets that orbit their parent stars, preferably sun-like stars, and are in that Goldilocks zone where you could have liquid water. So we're really looking for Earth analogs to some extent. And then the second part is to follow that up by studying the spectra of these exoplanets and determine whether there's any evidence for life. The other part of the flagship recommendation is general astrophysics. It also has to do a large program of general astrophysics. The thinking that we've already put into this comes primarily from the Decadal Survey, and we're going to talk in a minute about some of the recommendations that the Decadal Survey made that have really shaped how we think about this. Also, the Large Mission Study report has focused how we think about what are we going to do differently this time as we put this very challenging mission together. And of course, we've got James Webb Space Telescope, which not only provided lessons learned from the design and the fabrication and the testing, but is continuing to provide lessons learned as it operates on orbit. So one of the things I showed at the AAAS meeting at the beginning of the year was this chart here, which talks about some big picture strategies, and I emphasize the word strategy here. So one is we're going to build it to a schedule, and that's something we're going to discuss. We're going to use technologies that we've already made investments in and evolve this technology. So that means we're going to really focus on segmented mirror telescope systems, which with JWST already at TRL9, and the work that we're currently doing on the Roman coronagraph and the kind of sensors that we're developing for these missions. We're going to use next generation rockets. We're going to plan to do servicing from day one, and we're going to design it with robust margins, and we're going to mature the technologies first before we start formulating the mission. And some of these come from the Decadal Survey, of course. So having laid that sort of out as the idea of where we're going to go with this, I wanted to start by having a discussion about some of these themes. And I'm going to start by asking Francesco, what do you think the Astro 2020 decadal recommendations got right?
Well, I got most of it got it right, but I would point out that they clearly articulated why a 6.5 meter ERUV is needed to accomplish decadal science. It spent a great deal of time, a great number of pages articulating that, and it proposed a certain architecture, but not in detail. It could have gone into details specifying what needed to be built. It didn't do that, just said what science it needed to accomplish, and it proposed a top-level scheme on how to do that. Another very important thing that the Decadal did is to recommend the establishment of a maturation program, what is now called the GOMAP. I don't think the Decadal called it that, because what we now call the Habitable Worlds Observatory, they didn't call it that, is going to be far in the future. And in order to get there, we need to mature the technology, but we also need to assess what, which is something we learned from JWST, what issues there might be in integration and testing. And also, we need to spend a great deal of time establishing an architecture and validate and banging that architecture against the science that we want to accomplish before actually fixing a design. Because that will allow us, which we can discuss later, to assess what the cost and scale. Mark was talking about developing this on a fixed schedule, like a planetary mission. In order to do that, you have to have a good estimate of what the cost is, and you have to have be able to confidently discuss a profile. So that those are the things that I think I've talked enough.
Anybody on the panel want to add anything?
I'll just add that I think the decadal survey process is just so crucial to what we do, right? The stakeholders on the Hill in OMB use these decadal surveys. And so just sort of a little bit of a plug that if you're ever asked to serve on one of these, please do. This is a really big deal. And so what did they get right? They got the process right, right? This is how we do science in the US. And so I think that's really important.
And I just might add, I think one of the things that I think they really got right was they were bold and ambitious. One of the things that I think really helped with James Webb was, the fact that it was ambitious and bold attracted great people to work on it. It got support. People were excited. Young people were excited about it. I think, it was particularly difficult because James Webb hadn't launched when this decadal went on. Yet they were ambitious, and they articulated that ambition very well in terms of what the scientific goals were without overly constraining things. And I think that really is what you want out of a decadal, and I think that'll serve us well in terms of kind of going forward.
And if I may, getting back to your comment about the decadal process, that's also an opportunity for early career people to really be involved in the process and the future planning for the community.
Absolutely, yeah. Sarah, I wanted to ask you, how do you think, or how should industry partner with academia and the government to, better develop these large observatories?
Thanks, Mark. So it's going to be really important as we venture into these new, larger observatories, just like with Roman, with the James Webb Space Telescope, to really partner early with NASA industry partners, international partners, to get the technology development right initially. Thinking about bringing the best creativity from all the different parts of the workforce together is going to be really crucial as we go forward in these large missions. And maybe we'll talk about this later too, following on the panel this morning, but really bringing in the diversity, the inclusion, all that creativity, all of those really great ideas is going to be really important. And so having all of the industries in the US involved as much as possible, as early as possible, is really crucial, because we're all doing our own investments, and bringing those in early and often and together as partners is going to be how we can succeed in this.
Absolutely. So one of the other things I wanted to sort of touch on was, how the large fairings and the opportunities presented by launches really impact our ability to sort of optimize the design. ZB, would you like to speak to that or think about that?
I can speak to that, certainly in the context of,
Sure.
of Dragonfly, in that after we were selected, we were directed to the 5-meter fairing, which allowed us to grow the aeroshell and thus the scale of the Dragonfly lander, which, for those who aren't familiar with it, the Dragonfly lander is actually a rotorcraft. And so by being able to make use of the larger fairing, we can actually have larger rotors, which facilitates, of course, our ability to fly on Saturn's moon Titan. So these opportunities really allow people to take the best advantage of the launch capability to be able to affect the most science exploration, et cetera.
I can see you wanted.
Yeah. Well, it's hard not to comment on that after, decades on JWST where we were highly constrained. We were trying to fit a 6.5-meter telescope in a 5-meter rocket. And equally hard was the fact that, we had to build JWST, it weighs 6,100 kilograms, which is about half the mass of Hubble. And now even Roman launching on a Falcon 9 Heavy gets almost double the mass. So we had very tight constraints on mass and volume, and that was a challenge. And that, made the sun shield as complex as it was in order to fit. And it meant we had to do very aggressive light weighting and iterating those light weighting. So mass and volume is a huge enabler But at the same time, I worry a little bit, it may not be the panacea that everybody thinks. I think we have to be careful to use that mass and volume wisely and maintain large margins, and also be careful about trying to guess where rockets will be 20 years from now. Because even 20 years ago, people gave us an estimate of where we'd be, and that whole field evolved. So we need architectures that will be flexible enough to make use of whichever rockets are there and economic and ready to be used. So it's kind of a two-sided coin, that it's both a great opportunity, but we need to be careful about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I want to foot stomp that the main positive impact of large rockets that we're now contemplating is the margins. It is really like what it's the margins. It's not the idea of using all the capability. It's the idea of having a large amount of margin. That's the most positive. But there is also a negative. The negative is these rockets are in early development phase now. They're not there. So the negative impact is that we'll have to design the habitable worlds observatory in order to be able to be compatible with a number of rockets, the capabilities of which we don't know. So and not only that, but we'll have to keep in mind the possibility, I wouldn't say probability, but the possibility that none of these will be available in the time of the HWO, and therefore we will have to have a plan B at the very beginning. If we don't have one of these large rockets, what do we do? That's
So what I'm hearing there is that the ability to be able to have a large segmented mirror gives you a lot of flexibility to work around whatever kind of fairing.
Absolutely, that's right.
Yeah.
As opposed to say, okay, we have this large capability, let's push the envelope there. No, let's not do that. Let's keep our options open.
And there's one of the things I really don't think people appreciate is when you build these complex observatories, which I'm sure Dragonfly is going through, the devil's in the details. And when you start, with all those little details, if you just start making things that are massive and very different, I'll give you one little detail of James Webb Space Telescope is that large telescope had to deploy away from the spacecraft, so we needed these release devices. And there was no release device large enough at the time, so we literally had to double the diameter of the largest low shock release device that existed. That was like almost a technological item, and we sweated it for years because those were all single point failures and really difficult. And so when, just because you have mass doesn't mean, and volume, you could get yourself in a box just thinking it's going to be easy and going down a path you haven't really done the pathfinding of, whereas a lot of what we've done on JBST has been pathfinding, and so we want to evolve from that. Essentially,
the key is what Mark said: keep the margin.
You want to keep the margin. You also there's that trade between using the volume or having mechanisms for deployments, et cetera. And so there's the risk side as well. So that having the larger capacity allows one to actually make that trade in an informed manner and keep the margins, but also manage risk.
So let me ask Lee, whether the Habitable Worlds Observatory, the primary technical tool pole is achieving contrast of 10 to the 10. So how will the sort of technology requirements for habitable worlds differ from the challenges that we've seen with building Webb?
So it actually turns out that so first of all, what does it mean? A lot of people don't appreciate what does it mean to have a contrast of 10 to the 10th. And what it means is you've got this very bright star and this very dim Earth-like planet, and there's a factor of 10 billion difference between them. So we need these special types of instruments that can block that very bright star, but at the same time, we can have little changes in the shape of the mirrors, particularly the primary mirror, create little, we call them speckles, little speckles of light that will look like planets. And so it actually turns out from the observatory point of view, really the hardest thing on Habitable Worlds Observatory is going to be the stability of the primary mirror, which is something we've learned a lot about from James Webb Space Telescope. And in fact, the stability of JWST is remarkably good, which we're really happy about. And it is almost exactly matching our models, which gives us a lot of confidence. But the stability we need for this 10 to the 10th coronagraph is going to be factors of 100 to 1,000 more stable. And so that really is the main technological challenge. And what that really, and that's where the early investments in technology really need to focus, is how do we deal with that? And JWST was a passive telescope. You know, we move it around, we don't actively move things, but to get to these levels, we're probably going to need something that's more active. And I think that's going to be the big difference.
Oh, okay. So, ZB, coming from the planetary community, I have a question for you about build to schedule. So, you know, how do you build a mission like this to schedule, and what does it take to make that actually happen in reality?
That's a that's a very long answer. There are a lot of different aspects that need to come together for that. You know, one of the things that you mentioned early on, and that we discussed in the study, is really knowing what you need to do, what the requirements are, where your margins are, so that you can address things and work things as they come up, as well as understanding your science margin. So you know, in terms of your requirements, you know, what things can be modified as you go along, as you find those things that sometimes you anticipate and sometimes you don't. There are, you know, so there's the aspect of, on the technical side, having everything as mature as possible, and there's always this tension, right? Because you want to do new things and you want to develop new technologies, but that can, as you were saying, right, that adds, you know, that adds risk, that adds potential complexity in the development cycle. And so having a very good understanding of what technologies, where you really need to invest, and where that investment can be done before, you know, you get into the actual mission development cycle, so that you're not, you know, so that doesn't complicate your schedule. And then, of course, you know, there's always the external factors as well, and making sure that as we work with NASA, as we work with partners, everyone has an understanding of the plan, of what needs to happen when, so that so that not only the technology and the development come together at the right time, but the funding is available at the right time, and you can work to a functional funding profile and things like that. And of course, that takes, you know, the entirety of everyone involved in the process.
Right. So you almost have to, well, I say almost, you do have to have some kind of understanding from a very early stage with the stakeholders about how the funding profile is going to look and how it needs to stay in order to meet that requirement.
Exactly, and they need to have a very good understanding of what the real drivers for the mission are, because obviously there are things that have to change sometimes in the funding cycle, but knowing which the very key aspects need to stay on target and which have more flexibility. So that communication with NASA and that partnership is really essential.
If I may, Mark, just to sort of reiterate that, because I think this is really important, right? Nailing down the science goals very early on and then sticking to them so that the technology that we're developing is specifically for those science cases for HabWorlds is going to be really important. Then there also needs to be a process developed by which we can assess new science cases. Guaranteed before HabWorlds launches, something about the universe will be discovered that we did not know about, and we might want to go do some observations that we didn't even know we needed to do, right? And so assessing those science cases and not just hanging every new thing on the mission is going to be really critical. That assessment needs to be not just the scientific impact of taking those new observations, but also the technology, the schedule risk, everything that goes into putting that new, maybe it's a new instrument, maybe it's a new observing method into the observatory, and really understanding what the impact is going to be towards the launch date as we're trying to really nail down when we're going to launch Hab Worlds.
I want to stress, to elaborate a bit on the point you just made. It is fundamental in order to have to be able to meet the fixed launch date. It is fundamental, and that's why the GOMAT program that the decada recommended is most important, to establish a reliable, solid, optimal funding profile. It's not going to be able to meet the fixed schedule without an optimal funding profile. So we have to be very confident of that. That will also help in discussing, shall we say, selling the program to the political stakeholders, because it will demonstrate our confidence in our estimates and also will hold us to the milestones. The other point is, as we go forward, as you were saying, we'll need to be clear of what science we're willing to let go in order to meet the schedule. So you can call it a de-scope plan, or you can call clarity in the science objectives, but you have to be clear as what are you going to give up in order to meet that. Naturally, you can think of that as two concentric circles, the middle one of which is the core that you cannot give up, otherwise the mission is pointless. But the external one, you'll give it up as the program progresses in order to meet the schedule and the cost. So those
So I think what you're saying is you need a sort of change in science culture that moves you more to sort of thinking like a PI-led mission rather
that's right,
than...
precisely.
Yeah.
Because the PI does have a fixed budget and a fixed schedule. So that's what they do, as you know. They give up capabilities in order to stay within the budget. They cannot increase it, and to meet the schedule.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question, then I'm going to throw it open to the audience. So if you have a question, this would be a good time to start getting ready. But I wanted to ask each of the panel members, what do they think getting to TRL5 before you start doing the formulation actually looks like? I guess we can start with Sarah at the end there.
Yeah, this is a standard question, right, that we always think about when we're designing missions. When you think about TRL5, you have to think about what kind of technologies are you going to need. But I want to go back to the science case, right? You need to nail down what your science case is going to be. And even for a mission like Hab Worlds, thinking about sort of the science traceability matrix and how that leads over to the mission traceability matrix, and then really nailing down what technologies you're going to need to head towards. I mean, TRL5 is a fine place as a goal, but some of the technologies will probably take longer to develop than we have in that short interim.
Jessica?
But I have a hard time improving on what Sarah just said. So I'll second that.
Lee, thoughts on this?
Yeah, you know, we've done a lot of, they call it road mapping in the past about technology needs for the missions, the mission studies that led to this. So we have some idea. I would say two things. One is I really think that we should not forget how important the architecture is. You know, I actually think 80 to 90% of the cost of these big observatories is baked in the early phase when you architect it. And so we need to be studying the architecture in parallel to developing the technologies, and having, you know, sort of trades and open thinking a little bit in key areas. And then for those key areas, you know, I actually am a real believer in competition. This was extremely successful in the development of the mirrors for JWST. And, you know, Dr. Clampin knows this because we were on a panel together where there was this very intensive competition between beryllium and glass for the mirror technology for JWST. And that competition led those teams to put their best people on it and to work really hard. And so, you know, on the one hand, I definitely think we need to be collaborative in architecting open systems, but I also think we should have technology investments so that there's competition and we're not dependent on only one solution, which might prove to be a difficult solution. So you kind of win two ways doing that. And so that, to me, that's the path to TRL5 is really critical, and I think it involves those kinds of investments.
Yeah, I would agree. The investment in technology development is key to have the technologies at the right maturity when you need them, and that needs the forward thinking, right? And we were speaking earlier about the decadal survey process. There's also the need for the longer term kind of vision to be able to anticipate where technology may be needed, so that you're not in a position of having the key and enabling technology not quite at the maturity level that you want, to keep the mission development on schedule.
Yeah, but like Liz said, technology is very important, but it's not the major driver for a mission of this size. The major driver is the architecture, the integration, and the testing. Yeah, that's what. There is some time, and we know that, but there is some time a magical thinking about technology. If you have all the technology developed to TRL9, forget 5, forget 6, TRL9, you still have all the problems.
Yeah.
And you mentioned testing. I just want to pick up on that
Yes.
because testing was such a challenge, for big telescopes, or it always is a challenge. But if you architect the system, for example, some of these active controls might be a lot easier to test. One of the big trades that the LUVOIR and HABEX study teams did was looking at, do we also want to be cryogenic, and the answer was, well, if it's a room temperature telescope like Hubble, we can test things in a clean room that we would otherwise have to do in a very complicated vacuum system. And so that architecture, and it's related to the science and the science drivers, but you got to get that right. And the technology is in parallel to it, but they're complementary.
And there can always be surprises in the technology, as you say, that's at TRL9, and so the test and the development is key. Yeah.
Just coming back to your point about cryo, Lee, I mean, it's also the case, isn't it, that if you are going to operate the mirror at cryogenic temperatures, you have to cryopolish it. And then if you're worried about picometer stability, as you mentioned, you've got a whole separate issue with modeling the structure as well.
Yeah, and it turns out that almost every material property that when it goes cold gets worse from the point of view of stability, damping, coefficients of thermal expansion, your uncertainties on all that stuff. So yeah, I mean, it's a much more difficult problem. And the other big factor that we considered in some of these early trades was the fact that we also want this next generation telescope to work in the ultraviolet. And ultraviolet is really sensitive to molecular contamination, and cold mirrors attract molecules. So there's all sorts of reasons why we kind of evolved the architecture the way we did, but now we need to have the discipline to stick with these things, or we'll grow the cost and the complexity and the time and the schedule.
Okay, so do we have questions? Okay.
Hi, Aki Roberge from Goddard. I wanted to ask about one of your other principles we haven't discussed, which was the servicing. Two-part question really. So how will that change how we design and implement Habitable Worlds Observatory, which differently from JWST, for example? And then the second part of that question is, and can we really count on having it, the servicing capability, when we need it?
I'll take a crack at the first part.
Yeah, good, because I didn't quite hear the question.
So I think, Aki, the question was, how do we bake in serviceability in the architecture?
No, well, yeah. Well, how would the fact that we are going to be all in for serviceability from day one, how will that change how we design it or implement it, the mission?
Okay.
So I think an interesting answer to the first part is it has the potential to make the architecture more complicated to think about, but easier to test, right? So think about modularity in terms of serviceability. And so we have more flexibility in the order that we test things, in the order that we put things in. God forbid we try to change focal planes at the last moment, right? But having serviceability gives us that opportunity to think about flexibility in design programs, in test programs, and in next generation instruments, which I think everybody thinks is really exciting.
I actually have to slightly disagree with that. I think that the planning for servicing at the very beginning, which wasn't done for JWST, of course, if you apply much thinking, will make the system simpler, not more complicated. Because in fact it is modular, so you have to think about it, and you say, I have to think of a way in which a robot going there can extract, and at the end you'll end up with a simpler design. So that's my slight disagreement.
And more importantly, I mean, we have a great model for this, which is Hubble, you know, where we started with the first generation of instruments, and then we're able to get more and more complex instruments on the second and the third servicing mission. And it really could be valuable for coronography, because these chronographs are really challenging. And, you know, ultimately we want them over many different, you know, wavelength bands and with additional levels of complexity. But if we can start with something that's simpler and maybe more like the chronograph that's going in the Roman Space Telescope, we can build the schedule, you know, we can do this whole thing faster and get the observatory built and understood, and then we can upgrade from there. So to me, that could be very transformative. You know, on JWST, one of the real challenges was the instruments actually turned out to be more expensive than the telescope because they were so tightly packaged, and we needed the final capabilities. You know, if you look at how complex the instruments are on JWST, they're really complicated, which is one of the great things that makes it so powerful. But it meant we had to completely develop all these technologies and build these complex instruments. We didn't have the option, like Hubble had, of getting up there with a small CCD and then each generation a larger detector and a larger field of view. And so that to me could be very powerful.
So there was a second part of that question. Does anybody want to take a shot at that?
What was that? I didn't hear that.
How do we?
Sorry, I was wondering, and how confident may we be that the capability for servicing will in fact exist when we need it?
Well, let's just say, you know, one of the things, I think we need to find that out. But I'm really impressed with what's going on in the commercial world right now, you know, being able to service satellites potentially at GEO, and what the cislunar folks are thinking about. I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to leverage things that are being done, even for the lunar program, in terms of capabilities. And so I think this is, you know, I don't think we know the answer yet. I think we need to find out, but certainly, you know, robotics has really changed. You know, I mean, look at Dragonfly, and then, you know, how impressive it is. So it's a question, though, you know, when we serviced Hubble, the science side did not pay for the servicing costs, right? That was the shuttle and the human program. So the question is, can we leverage what the human program and the exploration program are doing? And that's what we need to find out.
Yeah, and I think that the capability of servicing will exist. It's, as you said, it's already there. But what HWO and the program will have to do is provide a forcing function to have a capability of servicing in the way that we need, which is very different. We're not talking about refueling. Mm-hmm. We're talking about replacing instruments or maybe modules, and also where it is. Because much of the servicing capability, all of the commercial one is in LEO. Some of it is in GEO, but it's not at that too. Yeah. So I think the capability will be there, but I think we cannot be casual and anticipate that we'll be there to do what we need, where we need it. So we need to make clear what our needs are.
Defined.
Okay, should we take another question?
I'm Robin Millen from Dartmouth. So I think Nikki made a really great case for an integrated science at NASA. And habitable world seems like a great example where all the other science disciplines have expertise to contribute. I know it's very early in the mission planning, but I'm wondering if you've thought about how to engage the other science disciplines, the geochemists, the people who know how to model atmospheres, and the heliophysicists who know how stellar activity influences planets and so forth. Is there plans for engaging those communities, and also are there investments that need to be made in those communities?
So I can actually address that one. I think we've already started doing that to a large extent, and including the heliophysics community and the planetary community, especially in thinking about exoplanets. And I think on Wednesday evening you actually saw a presentation from Krista Peters-Lidard, which showed that now we've got the Earth science community engaged in helping to model exoplanet atmospheres. And even for James Webb, one of the key challenges is how do I understand these really amazing spectra that I'm getting from transit observations, and having this new modeling capability is built upon decades of expertise in understanding climate and all the things that go into climate models, I think is really important, and being able to transform them to model exoplanetary systems is going to be very powerful. And in fact, some of that expertise was actually used in building the exposure time simulators for Webb. So I think we already are starting to do that, and we have a new program scientist at headquarters, Sean Donegal-Goldman, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, but I'm sure he's watching on the live stream, and he's an astrobiologist first and foremost. And we're trying to bring in astrobiology as well, because I think that's going to be a fundamental part of understanding biosignatures. And as we move forward and we start to ask the science community to look at trades on priorities in general astrophysics, and then do science trades on how we do the survey, and then the follow-up work, having the astrobiology community involved can be fundamental.
That's great to hear. Thanks.
Hey, I'm Jake Richmond, Goddard Office of Communications. So with my background in mind, this is fascinating. I'm just curious. We are in the business of testing and launching. We definitely pay attention to close calls. And from a communication standpoint, as successful as JWST has been, it's been the coolest thing I've had a chance to work on, even a little bit. It's easy to forget, not for probably people here, but for a lot of the American public, that in 2011 it was almost killed in the House. Well, it was, the funding was cut in the House, and so I'm just curious, as part of this strategic mission planning, have we learned any concrete lessons from how to avoid those close calls in the future on that side of the mission planning, particularly with communications in mind? Thank you.
Lee?
Well, I mean, I'd say two things. One is, you kind of touched on this, but I think, kind of getting the plan right from the beginning is critical, the dollar phasing plan. We definitely did not get it right in the beginning of JWST. It was such a new thing. We really, the folks who formulated it really didn't have a phasing plan that ultimately we could live by. And I think that really was an issue. So I think starting with a plan that you can live by, and not being overly aggressive, but having the right amount of dollars. But the second thing is, why did it move forward? Why did JWST move forward? And I think the answer there is, I would say the answer there is, think about your neighbor's kids. I gave a talk to our neighbor's kids right before we launched JWST, and they showed up with notebooks of how they could build bigger telescopes. And this 8-year-old girl knew more about mid-infrared spectroscopy than anybody on the project. And so, it dawned on me that, inspiring the next generation is what this is all about. And if we're bold and ambitious, and it's something that an 8-year-old will want to sketch on a notebook, like a dragonfly or like a JWST, I mean, those are the kind of things that are going to get support all the way through. But you want to get the plan right, because you need the credibility. And I think we can build on what we've learned from JWST in that regard.
Yeah, you need to have the plan right, absolutely. But you also should not be afraid of talking about the observatory. You should be bold in saying, we need this to push back the wall of ignorance, to quote Thomas. And this is the reason why this is needed, this is what it's gonna do, and we're gonna deliver it. But so you shouldn't be afraid, like pull back and say, well, maybe we don't need to do, no, we need to do this because, you know, this country is the first in the world in science in order to keep the, but not only for the political reason, is that you want to understand the university, and you know that to do that, you have to do this, and these are the reasons. Having said that, you have to have the plan, because otherwise people say, okay, you know, you just want a bunch of money. Well, here is the plan, we're gonna stick to it, we're gonna launch on this date, but we need this. So you need to put it all together. Why are you doing that? How are you doing that? All at the same time.
And the framework to do the communication to the community and to, you know, and to the taxpayers who are ultimately the source of the, you know, the resources that are used. And so having that framework is very important as well.
I'll just add to that. You know, one of the things I've been really impressed with is how well written and put together the 2021 Decadal Survey actually is in terms of the recommendations and how they lay out the program. And that's very useful because, you know, as stakeholders, you know, live by that document and hold us to account by referring to that document continually. So having a document that's, you know, basically drawn very heavily on things like the large mission study and lessons learned is a really great start in moving forward and addressing that question that was asked.
Thanks. Kind of two things. One, a compliment, and then a sort of ask the converse of one of the previous questions. The compliment is, you know, the fact that JWST has already done amazing planetary science by looking at, you know, Neptune and you know, Jupiter, and, you know, it's just amazing pictures for the public, but also planetary science, I'm hoping. So the converse of the question about future planning that includes multiple disciplines is sort of a question about the ongoing work and the future plans for kind of RNA and work done with both Hubble and James Webb, and of course in the future across multiple disciplines. How do we? My background is planetary science, and thank you, Zibby, for your work on Dragonfly. But how do we maximize the possibility that Webb will help us drive down the risk of landing on Titan, for instance, by taking great observations, or Enceladus, or something like that? How should we as a community engage with you to make sure that that cross-fertilization happens with the current assets?
I think that speaks to, you know, what Nikki referred to of, you know, considering all of ourselves as parts of a joint endeavor, and having that communication, you know, between groups, between missions, between, you know, scientific disciplines. Speaking specifically to JWST, right? JWST has already taken images of Titan and showed us, and there is a you know, kind of a long-term plan to monitor Titan from time to time. We also do that, of course, with Earth-based observatories. But this will allow us to track aspects of the weather that we can no longer do because we don't have Cassini at Saturn. And so JWST, in fact, did reveal clouds, as we expect in the, you know, the northern hemisphere of Titan during its northern summer, and that you know, is of course very valuable, and something that you need the RNA support, as you refer to really, you know, to really develop and do the work. And then, you know, moving forward, right, we also have missions in development like Dragonfly or Europa Clipper, right, that are studying habitable worlds that will inform the types of measurements and the interpretation of the measurements from the Habitable Worlds Observatory. And so we have these connections, and to your point, we really need to make sure we are making the most of them and bringing in the broad community to do that work.
And I just want to also then carry this forward to the Habitable Worlds Observatory. We had planetary scientists who were part of the LUVOIR team, I remember. And as we're planning the instruments, we need to be thinking about, just like Hubble did at these wavelengths and Webb is doing, what planetary science do we want to do with Habitable Worlds Observatory? And not just even planetary, but this whole idea of the interconnectedness of it all. We heard earlier in the week about these ideas of digital twins, but even when we start thinking about looking at exo-Earths, and is there anything we're going to learn about those relative to our own Earth in terms of testing models? So like crossing the different science areas, I think, is really a great suggestion, and we have done that at some level in the architecture, but now is a great time to do that and make sure we're getting as much as we can out of all this.
I'll just add to that. So two things. One is that every morning, first thing I do when I get to the office is sit and drink my coffee, and while I'm doing that, I check how many JWST papers were submitted overnight. And there's something like 1 to 2 coming in every day at the moment. It's incredible. And one of the things is you start to look at what those papers are telling us, and the issues that or the scientific challenges that they're addressing. What you see is that we're really starting to get to the place where we can answer the questions that we built Webb to address. So I think the messaging that we really did succeed with this telescope and is doing what we said it would do is absolutely fundamental as we talk about what we want to do next. The other point I'll just make in terms of what will the legacy of Webb be? I mean, if you look back, the legacy of Hubble's been the deep field, and then the ultra deep field, the extreme deep field, and they pretty much spawned the James Webb Space Telescope. We built Webb because we knew we were going to hit a wall at some point and would need to go to the infrared. I think you can already start to see the writing on the wall with Webb. If you look at the breakdown by scientific discipline of the Cycle 2 proposals, just before they've been reviewed, just the number coming in, something like 50% are there to do exoplanet science. So you can kind of see that Webb is going to probably produce a very strong sort of upswell of interest in exoplanets as we go forward, just because it's doing so much and will do so much more over the next decade.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And thanks for all of the great work on Webb.
So, Mark, Executive Director privilege here. I'm going to ask a question. I'm no engineer or scientist, but there's a famous saying, a camel is a horse designed by a committee. Can you talk about the decision-making process and trade-offs and sacrifices that happen during the planning phases of these large missions with respect to, we talked about modularity, and on the flip side, specific objectives and instruments. So how does that happen? Engineers versus scientists versus economics, everything like that. How does that all happen? Who's final decision maker? Can you just talk to us a little bit about that process?
Okay, I guess I should start. So let me talk about what we're doing next. So the next thing that we're doing is starting up a large group. There will be a Dear Colleague letter shortly that will seek candidates for membership of that group. And we're going to task them with the difficult task of starting to look at the science traits. And you've heard again and again, if we build a Christmas tree, we won't get there. So we need to be focused and mindful that we have to keep the primary goals in mind and make sure that we're not sort of expanding the science beyond what we can do with this particular telescope. So that group will focus on 2 areas, as I said a while ago. One is we're really going to focus in on what are the science priorities for the general astrophysics, because that will play into the architecture. And we will also have the group start to look at some of the science trades for exoplanets. And to backstop that, we have work going on with the Exoplanet Program Office and our ExoPAG working on the bigger issue of what stars do you actually survey to find these habitable planets. And that turns out to be very important. You know, there are two main things, you know, what is the nature of the stars in that sample? You know, as the more turn out to be binaries, you end up having to go back and look at architecture traits like the size of your mirror. And of course, the other big one is eta sub Earth, or how many, you know, how many stars do you have to look at, you know, to find a, you know, Earth-like rocky planet? And that number's a little bit all over the map at the moment. There was a really nice talk you can find on the AAS archives that Jesse Christensen gave at the beginning of the year addressing that. But things like that are going to shape the architecture quite a bit. So that group is getting started this year. In the meantime, we have both of our program offices. The Cosmic Origins program office is starting to work on a technology roadmap for the ultra-stable structures. You know, where do we need to go? What do we need to do? And the Exoplanet program office is addressing some of these roadmap issues for the coronagraph technology. And it kind of falls into two areas. One is, you know, how do you do the best coronagraphy on a segmented mirror telescope? And the other part is, you know, what technologies do you need there? And the most obvious one is making masks. You know, do we have the right capabilities? And the other one is the actual deformable mirrors themselves. Can we scale them to larger sizes? And we may end up getting to the point where we need to do, say, a sort of technology shootout of the kind Lee was talking about. So that's where we are in the short term. Now, as you saw from the first chart I showed, you know, some of the things we have already put into our strategy. So if you follow the decadal survey's recommendations, they say the first 5 years you get the key technologies, and I emphasize the word key, to that TRL5 point, and then you move into formulation once you've got those technologies at a level where you know they work and you know how they're going to work together as a system. So that's you know, further into the future. But the problem is, you know, given the investment you have to make in that period to get those technologies there, you really have to narrow down the focus of what you can do. And, you know, the common theme that we took from LUVOIR and the HABEX study is the large telescope with the coronagraph. And then we looked at where is NASA making investments, and in particular, where is astrophysics making investments already that will leverage that. And the obvious one is JWST, where we have a lot of investment in large segmented mirror telescopes. And APD has been investing in ultra-stable structures and technologies for segmented mirror telescopes since 2017. So we decided to narrow down the focus so that we could get to where we need to be for TRL5 on the time scale that we have to do this. So that's kind of how things are working out right now. As we go forward, we will probably at some point create a program office, and that program office will sort of run very similarly to the Roman Space Telescope program office and run the program.
In a general sense to the decision-making, one of the things obviously that is absolutely essential is well-defined requirements. But another aspect that is essential is an understanding across the different disciplines, right? Science, engineering, management, of what those requirements are intended to do. And blurring those lines between the science and the engineering, so that when a decision is needed, everyone, to the extent possible, has the context of what the implications will be, both in terms of the, you know, the mission design, the development, the cost and schedule implications, as well as the science impact, so those can be informed. And the better communication in that sense that you have across the team and to the, you know, to the levels at which you want the decisions made, so that not every decision has to rise up to be efficient. The better understanding, the more effective you can be and nimble in terms of making those decisions as you move ahead.
Yeah, and yeah, I think maybe a more broader way even to say what you're saying, and I 100% agree with everything, is it's all about system engineering, which you would think, you know, that's what we do at NASA, right, is system engineering, but it is amazing how every mission has its own unique aspects of system engineering. And system engineering, goes all the way from science down to these requirements and technologies. And it is a real challenge with all these different committees to do it really well. I do wonder whether system engineers would have designed a camel. I'm not quite sure. But an example of why we are taking this seriously is, Mark mentioned this ultra-stable roadmap committee. We actually put two categories in there. One is just called systems and one is called verification, which are not typically things you think of when you think of technology. But the technology needs are actually driven a lot by the system. The way you achieve stability is at the system level. And so, we're actually trying to inject it into the technology process. So I think that, and the words you were saying basically are system engineering, I think, requirements and all. So that'll be the discipline we need to have.
Jim, I'll just finish the discussion on this by saying, the other goal that we have is to be as inclusive as possible. We need new ideas, new thinking. Yes. Some of the technology challenges will be really hard, and the more inclusion you have and more diversity ideas, the likelier you are to succeed. So, we count that as a really important value as we move forward with this program.
All right, thank you, Mark. And in the spirit of your last point, NASA's recently established, with respect to in-space servicing, NASA's recently established an ISAM national consortium, which is being referred to as COSMIC. Are there plans for engagement between the Habitable Worlds Observatory planning and say, leveraging capabilities that are going to be coming through the COSMIC consortium?
We have not engaged with them yet, but I will note that several of the members have previously sort of been heavily involved in thinking about both HABEX and LUVOIR, so I'm sure there will be in the future.
Fantastic, thank you.
I guess we're at the end of our session here. So does anybody want to make any closing comments?
No.
Okay.
Excellent. Well, big round of applause for this panel. Fascinating talk. Thank you, Mark. Thank you.